Some of you may or may not be aware of this, but I'm a therapist in my day job. It's not too bad, but be a little bit honest with you. I often find myself looking for the exit. It's not to say my job is horrible. I like what I do, but I've been doing it for about 14 years now. And you got to understand, when you do what I do for as long as that, you tend to get a little bit restless and start hearing voices. So, no, not quite. But, there's an interesting thing here. When I get into that restless state, it does something to my psyche. It transforms me into an entrepreneur. Oh, I start scheming and plotting and planning for my next way out into my new life, right? And I am creative. I have done everything that you could think of. I've tried being a photographer all the way to being a stockbroker. Heck, I even picked up cooking for a little while. Well, we don't talk about that anymore, though. No, but I get it. I got an imagination. No, but whenever these daydreams of my ambitious daydreams, if you will, come up, they always run into a wall. A harsh reality. They never amount to anything. Now, I often try and play it off by just joking about the reasons that I failed, but do you want to know the real reason it happens? It's because any time ambition is present, it has to be willing to suffer through opposition. And opposition will come. It's as sure as death, taxes, or hitting traffic when you're running late. If you want to see ambition go anywhere, you have to be able to go through it. Unfortunately for me, I tolerate opposition about as well as I tolerate inspirational quotes on a coffee mug. Now, I don't like either of them very much. But this obviously bothers me some. Maybe I should see a therapist about it. But, in considering all these things, it's not a big deal, but when it does become more of a problem, when it begins to cause me to not be able to follow through with fully being obedient to God. Specifically, when He's calling me to persevere if I'm going through something difficult. I absolutely love the initial call that God puts on us. It's exciting, it stirs us, but the second that opposition hits, well, let's just say I can lose some of my enthusiasm. This causes me to think, how in the world do people do it? I hear countless stories of Christians who face opposition dead on, straight in the eye, and march straight through it. You read stories in the Bible about how these characters, these real people, seem to defy death itself. I often think, man, are these guys superhuman? But I have to continually remind myself that they share the same, flesh and bone of all humanity. But there is one character in particular that always catches my eye. One that's human but does come off as superhuman. It is the former cupbearer turned wall builder, Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah was no stranger to opposition whatsoever. He knew it like the back of his hand. But he finds himself here in chapter 6 through 7 on the cusp of facing opposition like he's never experienced before. Question is, will he be able to survive it? Let's find out. Verse 1. Now when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arab and the rest of our enemies heard that I had built the wall and that there was no breach left in it, although up to that time I had not set up the doors and the gates, Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, Come and let us meet together at Hakephraim in the plain of Ono. But they intended to do me harm. Now, if you've been keeping up with this series at all, you'll recognize we have some friendly, familiar faces in this verse. We've got ourselves Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. And these guys have been a thorn in Nehemiah's side since the beginning. And we see them show up in chapter 2, and they come verbally harassing Nehemiah for building the wall, but he just basically goes, nope, not doing that. And he carries on. But then they decide to return in chapter 4, and they turn up the heat a little bit, because now they're threatening violence against the workers. But Nehemiah outsmarts them again and continues on with the work. And then he goes into chapter 5, and they get kind of quiet. Quiet's not a bad thing, but any of you that have dealt with kids would know that silence is not always a good thing. And we see that here because it's likely that they're planning their next move. How do we take them down? But we see that it's not just them. It's all Nehemiah's enemies with them. Well, eventually their patience pays off. And they get word coming through the grapevine. The wall is almost finished. Whoa, they were salivating over that one because they've been waiting. They know that this is likely their last opportunity to stop this project, and they sure aren't going to be missing it. But it's a little strange. Just a little bit strange. Didn't we just say that the wall was almost finished? I think you're a little bit late. What are you going to do, show up and push a ladder over? Well, no. See, their ladder pushing days were long behind them because they were going to stay as far away from that site as possible. They learned from their past mistakes. They knew that they couldn't physically interfere with the wall because it was too well protected. So instead, they go, well, if we can't get the wall itself, we might as well get the leader. I mean, often when you take down a leader, the rest comes crumbling down right after now, doesn't it? It's not a bad plan. Only problem is, how do you end up getting someone like that, right? How do you end up roping them in? If you think about it, outright sabotage is just too blatant, right? It kills the whole effect. So they end up taking the cordial route. Oh, let's send for him. And it's been a while, so let's go ahead and send him an invitation to meet. After all, nothing says I missed you quite like setting up a murderous ambush, right? And so they call for him. Come and meet us in the plains of Ono. Oh, that's such a nice one, right? Well, that invitation is the equivalent of a shark asking you to come in for a nice swim. They were essentially inviting him into enemy territory. But here's the thing. That's weird. This is weird again because don't you think the guy owns a map? Right? This isn't going to be a surprise to him. It's not like he doesn't know that if he decides to go, he'll be saying, oh no. He knows this very well. It's not the sneakiest thing, but as bizarre as this tactic might look, we actually see what's going on. You see, when you're trying to catch a fishy and it's not biting, you got to find a way to distract them from that big old hook, right? You try and use some bait. And with Nehemiah, they know that their hook is awfully blatant. But they're hoping to hook the guy by his pride. Now remember, he's become the governor now. He's a man of power. And he's being beckoned by other people who equally have a lot of power and authority. You can almost hear the taunt here. The taunt of temptation. Hey, come on out, let your hands rest from the hard labor and come and do the work of a diplomat. Yeah, you deserve it after all, though, right? Oh, that's food for the ego. But that food will blind you. Even so, though, it's a good ruse, right? I mean, after all, power supposedly corrupts people. And Nehemiah is human. Oh, go ahead and bow down to your intuitions. Bite on it. But Nehemiah looks at this fishy hook in the form of a letter, and it doesn't seem to faze him. And as he looks closer, he goes, this thing is dangerous. And Nehemiah is not a man to let fire sit in his lap. And so he decides to respond to them in a very clever way. Here's what he says in verse 3. And I sent messengers to them saying, I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you. And they sent to me 4 times in this way. And I answered them in the same manner. Well, it turns out they're not dealing with a dumb fish here. This fishy's a smart one. And he responds in a kind of polite way, honestly. He's like, I'm sorry, I can't make it. I'm kind of busy right now. But then we also see kind of subliminally in this response, him telling them the reason why their bait didn't work on him. You see, they're fishing for a man of pride, like we've already said. A man that wants power. But Nehemiah doesn't really care about that at all because he's doing a great work. And he's got his eyes on the prize. And there's absolutely nothing that they could dangle in front of him that would make him leave that purpose. Oh, but then he decides to spice things up because his second part of his response turns into a very hefty backhand to the face. Why should I stop the work for you? I mean, you could just kind of see him, like planting his feet in the ground. He's getting dug in. And you can see the look in his eyes saying, I know what you're doing, and it's not working. Well, his enemies are probably seeing this and going, what? No. And so they too come over and they plant their feet in the ground. They go, you want to play it that way? I can do that too. And you can just see them looking back. We're going to be as persistent as you can be. And guess what? They were. Because I sent to the man 4 times and were rejected on each count. And this actually reminds me of a buddy of mine in college. This guy was a champion at taking rejection. He'd go and ask a girl out and get the door slammed in his face, but then he'd get right back up on that horse and go knocking again. Nothing stopped that guy. They say that persistence is a virtue, but in his case, it was borderline harassment. I never quite figured out either whether it was actually he was persistent or if he was just tragically unaware. But in any case, it seems that Geshem and Sanballat have been cut from the same cloth as my buddy. They just don't know when to quit. And so they keep on sending over and over and over again. But as much as they send, Nehemiah doesn't respond. Because Nehemiah is a man that is absolutely entrenched in humility. He doesn't need to be given tons of power and glory. He's not going to need the attention of a diplomat in order to continue to move forward. Instead, he simply rests in the work that God had given him to do. The temptation to fan the flames of our own pride is a real thing. And let me tell you what, it's going to come knocking way more than 4 times. But just because it's at the door in no way means that you all of a sudden are obliged to answer. In this example, the purposes of God are inside. Pride opens the door. Humility keeps it shut. Well, at any rate, these guys have lost the first round, but they're persistent. And so they say, we got to go to plan B. Take a look at verse 5. In the same way, Sanballat, for the 5th time, sent his servant to me with an open letter in his hand. In it was written, it is reported among the nations, and Geshem also says it, that you and the Jews intend to rebel. That is why you are building the wall. And according to these reports, you wish to become their king. And you have also set up prophets to proclaim concerning you in Jerusalem, there is a king in Judah. And now the king will hear of these reports. So now come, and let us take counsel together. Well, it seems that their limit for being rejected sits at about 4. So they drop the friendly pen pal act and instead pick up the sword of cowards, slander. And I'll tell you what, they go straight for the throat, and they embellish all along the way. All the nations, and Geshem, they know that the only reason that you are building this wall is so that you can rebel and make yourself king. In fact, I've heard from a little birdie that you've been installing prophets to declare your kingship just like they did in the olden days. It would be a really big shame if the king heard about this one, right? So I suggest you come to Ono. Well, if lies could build ladders, they'd be halfway to the moon right now. But even though their accusations sound like the quibbling of a 4-year-old, it does pack a punch. You see, Jerusalem did have a history of rebelling. And the fact that they're building a wall didn't make it look any less suspicious. No, but to make matters worse, it says that this letter was an open letter. And this means that it wasn't just quietly carried along. No, this thing was proclaimed to everybody. This is a master class in blackmail because they've got this guy pinned down with sinister gossip. And gossip sticks, even if it's not true. What if the king hears this? How are you going to explain it to him? If you try to defend yourself, you might look like you're fanning the fire. If you try to plead the fifth, you might look somewhat suspicious. Either way you hash it, this is a lose-lose situation for him. And that's exactly how Sanballat wanted it. Because Nehemiah had been able to weasel and wiggle his way out of every other problem he had faced, but finally all the corners and cracks had been shut off completely. The exits were closed. If he went, he would surely die. If he stayed, they would tattle on him to the king, and then he'd die. Pressure like that is enough to crack a diamond. What would you do? A better question is, what does he do? Let's take a quick look. In verse 8, then I sent to him, saying, no such things as you say have been done, for you are inventing them out of your own mind. For they all wanted to frighten us, thinking their hands will drop from the work, and it will not be done. But now, O God, strengthen my hands. Well, with fire in his bones, Nehemiah absolutely refuses to bow down to their trickery. This is like the part of an action movie where the hero is cornered, but then he defiantly spits in the face of the bad guy and jumps out a window. But he's serious, and he's not fazed at all. And we see it by his response, because he doesn't go through an itemized list and try and defend each claim they're making. No, he just makes one fell swoop. I didn't do it. Oh, but then he takes the opportunity to then return the favor back to Sanballat. He ends up saying, and I lost it right here. Look at that. I can't read. He's like, oh, yeah. You're basically making all these things up out of your mind. The wording for this is very, very interesting. It can get kind of intricate when you're looking at it. But if you were to tease out the nuance and see what this actually meant, he was saying, you're a lying rat. And essentially, of everything, he comes out and he's saying, you know what? You failed again. But for all his subtle bravado, this really was quite the risky tactic that he took. I mean, think about it. If the king had heard and decided not to listen to him at all, he just would have been flat out dead. The project would have died with him. It's about this point that I begin to feel and realize the weight that this situation actually held. If I'm being completely honest, I don't know if I would be able to stand in the face of that kind of opposition on my own. Just being honest. I wrestled with this for a little while. I finally came to understand Nehemiah didn't actually do this on his own either. If you look at the end of verse 9, he says that prayer, strengthen my hands. It's a simple prayer, but simple things are often the most beautiful, aren't they? The intention had been to weaken his hands, and who knows, maybe they succeeded in some measure. But rather than trying to pick himself up by his own bootstraps and claw along, he turned his eyes upward to get his strength. I wonder if maybe he felt the nearness of God in that time. There's no indication that he did. And even so, it seems that this prayer is a rally cry for him, a reminder that even though you're being slandered to high heaven, the Lord will never let your hand weaken, and He'll always sustain you to the end. And we can pray that prayer too. Lord, strengthen my weak, feeble hands when I face the most difficult of opposition. At this point, we got the score at 2-0. Things are getting a bit dicey for the enemies, but they still got enough energy for one last ploy up their sleeves. Let's take a look at verse 10. Now, when I went into the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, son of Mehetabel, who was confined to his home, he said, let us meet together in the house of God, within the temple. Let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. They are coming to kill you by night. Well, this already drama-laden story gets even spicier with a simple house visit. Nehemiah, for whatever reason, decides to go over to the house of Shemaiah, a man of mystery. We're not really told much of anything about him. Well, we can kind of surmise that he's probably part of a priestly class, but even that is just inference. And on top of that, this guy is locked up in his own house, but we're not necessarily told why. What we do know is that Nehemiah knows him, and he seems to trust him. And at some point in that conversation, Shemaiah comes out and he takes on the role of a lamenting prophet. We have to get you into the temple, and we've got to shut those doors quick because they're going to kill you, and they're going to do it tonight. Oh, thank God for good friends, right? Oh man, he was on the brink of being murdered that very night. And who knows, maybe Shemaiah was going through the same thing. Maybe that's why he was locked up in his house. He was hiding too. The both of them could run off to the temple now, though, and effectively save both their lives. What divine providence? Maybe. They say that warm handshakes don't always come with the best intentions. And I'd imagine that Nehemiah, as he heard Shemaiah speaking, maybe took a step back. I've heard those words before. Come and let us meet together in the... Oh, that's been used on me before. Something's not right. And in a moment of existential wrestling, Nehemiah lets out a cry of his own lament. And he says, should such a man as I run away? And what man such as I could go into the temple and live? I will not go in. Deep sobriety governed this governor. And it was because of that he was able to discern the words that were being told to him. And he was able to reject this offer for safety. But he didn't just do it by that sobriety. That sobriety was built up by his knowledge of Scripture, his knowledge of the law. He was well aware that if he were to run like a coward, he would be turning his very back on God. And that would have been the dumbest thing that he could have done to try and save himself, for his own self-preservation. Oh, but it gets worse. He's being asked to go into the Holy of Holies. And Nehemiah knows, hey, I'm a governor, but I'm not that guy. I have absolutely no right or business to be entering into that place, let alone shutting myself in. It's at this point that we begin to see the respect and the love that Nehemiah has for God. He would rather face his killers and die than sin against God. This guy doesn't play with sin. He doesn't want anything to do with it. But just because he doesn't sin doesn't mean that he won't have to feel the painful effects of it that comes from others. Let's look at verse 12 and on. And I understood and saw that God had not sent him, but he had pronounced the prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. For this purpose he was hired, that I should be afraid and act in this way and sin, and so they could give me a bad name in order to taunt me. Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, O my God, according to these things that they did, and also the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who wanted to make me afraid. Man, betrayal cuts deep, doesn't it? Nehemiah had been laboring relentlessly for the people, only to be betrayed by the very ones who were supposed to be supporting him in the first place. His good buddy, or so we think, Shemaiah, turned out to be a liar for hire. And the puppet master behind the whole thing was none other than Tobiah and Sanballat. But their hands had gone further than anyone could have ever imagined. Because it turns out that they had infiltrated the priestly ranks even more. Because we see that there were others who wanted to stop him, like the prophetess Noadiah and the other prophets that aren't fully named. This was a reality that he was dealing with. But let me ask you a question. Do you think he got angry? Do you think he grit his teeth when he saw the evil corruption that pervaded his government? Do you think that he grit his teeth when he saw how that evil corruption and treason had pervaded the very temple of God? Yeah, that would be more than enough to make any man want to take matters into his own hands. And he's powerful, so he could easily exact vengeance if he really wanted to try. But then we see he prays again. Oh God, remember what they did to me. Now this might seem like a bit of a harsh prayer at first. After all, aren't we supposed to pray for our enemies? Well, yes, we are. But we also got to understand that this is actually a prayer of restraint. For everything that Nehemiah could have done, he didn't. Instead, he gave it up to the Father. And he remembered that vengeance alone belongs to God. This is hard. This is painful, especially when you put yourself in that place. But this is righteous. And opposition can't stand against a person like that. Well, beaten and bruised and battered and torn, Nehemiah again lifts up his eyes and sets out to finish what he had started. Verse 15. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month, Elul, in 52 days. And when all our enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem. for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Moreover, in those days, the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah, and Tobiah's letters came to them. For many in Judah were bound by oath to him because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Arah. And his son, Jehohanan, had taken the daughter of Meshushalam, the son of Berechiah, as his wife. Also they spoke of his good deeds in my presence and reported my words to him. And Tobiah sent letters to make me afraid. Well, it had finally been finished. After all the taunts, attacks, and passive-aggressive letters, the wall had been completed in just 52 days, or a little over 7 weeks. Turns out, when you have a godly foreman, delays aren't really much of an issue, now are they? But that wall actually does more, the completed wall, I should say, does more than just shield a city. It actually reveals something, which is a good thing because I've had a question throughout this entire story. Where is God in all of this? View of the Almighty has been fuzzy at best. There's been no major miracles. There's been no divine words given. All we've seen is a man as he trudges through hell trying to finish a project. Oh, but then we look at this completed work, and it's like the veil opens up, and the glory of God enters through it. We see it entering because we see the response of his enemies. They tremble. The fear givers become afraid. And they fall in their own estimation. They get put in their place because they know they haven't been messing with a man. They've been messing with God himself. Brothers and sisters, this is the power of the completed work of God. It ushers in the presence of God with the full majesty and glory that comes with it. And it makes the wicked buckle at their knees under the reality of the one that they've been trying to evade. They can no longer ignore him. But for those who are called according to his purposes, they have their eyes opened. Those weak eyes can see, and they realize that they were never alone through any of it. God sends us an open invitation to persevere until the end because he knows he's already finished the work. There's really no risk in that, as risky as it is. What else could we want to do? The thing is, though, when you look at that invitation and you get a little closer, Santa Claus style, there's a bit of fine print on it. Completed work does not eradicate opposition. Not yet, anyway. And we see that in that last verse there because Tobiah continues to be present. And I should mention that this part is talking not only about what's already happened, but it's also alluding to what continues to happen here. He continues to be a thorn in his side. However, chapter 7 demonstrates that he was just as unsuccessful in stopping any of the work as he had ever been before. Nehemiah puts the finishing touches on the wall. He sets appointed people over it and gets it all ready. It's all set and done. He also brings in and makes way for this long list of exiles, the people of God, the Israelites, to finally rest in their towns. Now, that rest is so important, isn't it? And rest is what I would say kind of defines all of Nehemiah's ministry. Sure, when he faced opposition, I can't imagine him not having some ups and downs and emotional swings. He's human after all. But those things aren't reported because they didn't define him. You know what did define him? You want to know how you persevere and overcome opposition? Well, it's actually quite simple. Lift up your eyes as you labor with purpose. Lift up your eyes as you labor with purpose. Opposition comes to take away our focus off of the one that actually matters. It comes to distract us and tell us that the work cannot be finished. But when we lift our eyes up to heaven like Nehemiah did, when we say, God, strengthen my hands, when we say, God, you are my vengeance, I leave it in your hands, we're entirely free to continue the work. You know, I am personally a firm believer that God has given each and every single one of us work to do. I'm going to say this instead. Actually, I'm going to change it a bit. You know, the thing that comes to mind is like, I know that a lot of times what we end up doing is we say, I don't want to do that work. I'm not ready for that work. Because we see what it's going to cost us. We see what stands in our way. And so we go, that's just a pipe dream for me. Or maybe you're in the middle of ministry right now, and you're near the tail end of it, and you're exhausted. You're saying, I can't take another step. I just want to remind any of you in any of those places, whether you're a minister, a missionary, or a mother, it doesn't matter. The work set before you is the work of God, and He's promised that He'll see it through to the end. So work. You know, it reminds me of the old hymn, actually. And it goes something like this, you know. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in His wonderful face. And the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of His glory and grace. Lift up your eyes as you labor with purpose. Father, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done. Lord, we know through any circumstance that we find ourselves in, any work that you've given us to do, you will provide our daily bread. You will provide our salvation. You will provide for every need that we have. Only help us to turn our eyes towards you and allow the rest of the things, the opposition, the hardship of life, they're real and we don't set them aside. But at the same time, we look not at them, we look through them, knowing that one day everything will be made right. And that the finished work of God will one day truly end all opposition and suffering. So, Lord, strengthen our hands. Give us the ability to walk in your ways. And we thank you and we praise you. And it's in the name of your precious Son, Jesus Christ, that we pray.